Show me the hands of the naughty kids. Any here? The teacher's got a stick ready to smack you. Who's holding the stick and getting ready to smack someone? You'll have to listen to this video to find out. I'm going to tell you all about it. Just to give you a heads up, this video is about currency values, whether it's the Japanese yen, the US dollar, or any other currency that's paired with the dollar. In the previous video, I talked about the magic bar of the Japanese yen, remember? Suddenly, there was this spike that shot up. The yen, right? It weakened in such a dramatic way. It was almost unbelievable. What happened? I didn't explain it in the last video, but I'll talk about it in this one. The fact that the Japanese yen has weakened so much has really hurt the Japanese people. When the yen loses value, it means that even though people are getting the same amount of money, their purchasing power goes down. For example, if you earn a monthly salary of 20,000 baht, the number 20,000 baht doesn't change, but what does change is the purchasing power of that 20,000 baht, which goes down. This is what's called the real wage or actual wage. For Japanese people, their real wage has dropped for 23 consecutive months. The Japanese Ministry of Labor reported that as of this past February, the real wage was 1.3% lower than last year. So when the currency drops a lot and the money people have keeps losing value, what do Japanese people do? Of course, they tighten their belts. They have to be more frugal. This has caused household spending in Japan to drop by as much as negative 6.3%, which is the lowest it's been in the past 12 months. Because when the yen weakens, right, importing anything becomes expensive. Everything costs more. Japanese people just don't have the money to buy things, so they'd rather save instead. Now, let's get to this so-called magic bar. How can the yen get stronger again? The answer is actually really simple, not at all surprising, and that is the Japanese government intervenes in the yen exchange rate. How do they intervene? Let me explain. The method isn't complicated or hard to imagine at all. Since the yen is weak compared to the US dollar, the way to intervene is to sell US dollars and use that money to buy back yen. That's it. Just by doing this, the yen can get stronger? Well, that raises a question. If that's the case, then if Japan still isn't satisfied with how much the yen has strengthened, can they keep selling more dollars? Do they still have more dollars to sell? The answer is yes. If we don't consider any outside impacts, Japan still has a lot of US dollars left to sell. That's because Japan is the #1 creditor of the United States. In other words, Japan holds more US government bonds than any other country in the world. How much do they hold? As much as $1.15 trillion. Wow. So if you're wondering how much of those magic bars Japan sold to make the yen strengthen like this, how many dollars did Japan actually sell? They only sold about $23 billion. So if you want to know how many dollars Japan still has left to sell, just take $1.15 trillion and subtract $23 billion. That's the amount Japan still has left to dump if they want to. And as the yen gets stronger, like I said before, it's definitely good news for the Japanese people. But not everyone is happy about this. Janet Yellen, the United States Secretary of the Treasury, is not impressed at all. She even issued a formal warning to the public, questioning whether it's really okay for the Bank of Japan to intervene in the yen's value. But this time, Japan refused to back down or yield to the US. Masato Kanda, Japan's Vice Minister of Finance, basically, well, I saw the chat, but I didn't reply, you know? You messaged me online in a hurry, but I didn't read it. But let me say this. If the financial markets are running smoothly, normally no government wants to intervene. But when the market operates in an abnormal way, the Japanese government, has to step in and do what's right. Okay, let's keep following along and see why Janet Yellen wouldn't want the BOJ to intervene in the yen exchange rate. When the BOJ, Japan's central bank, intervenes in the yen, right, they're not intervening in the US dollar directly. So how does rain in Japan end up making it cold in America? Like I said, Japan can strengthen the yen by selling off US dollars, and that wouldn't look good at all if other countries, which basically means every country that pegs their currency to the US dollar, did the same thing. Just like Janet Yellen said, it's like following the rules set by a strict teacher. She'd smack the board with a pointer to discipline all the naughty kids. You can't just act out and go against the rules like this. By the way, Janet never actually said this. I'm just joking around. Now, let's break it down point by point as to why the United States doesn't like currency intervention. The first reason is inflation. If the US dollar gets stronger compared to other currencies, that means America will be able to importing various goods and services at a significantly lower cost. When the US can import these goods at much more affordable prices, that's another effective way America can fight inflation. Because cheaper imports mean lower overall production costs, which in turn means inflation is less likely to spiral out of control. And by keeping the US dollar strong, America won't necessarily have to be as concerned about trying to cut interest rates as a policy. So the question is, does the US Federal Reserve or the US government really feel any urgent need to cut interest rates? Is the industrial sector, the financial and economic sectors in the US actually able to handle things as they are? Let's look at the first point, which is the unemployment rate. Many people say that if the economy isn't doing well, the unemployment rate should be high, right? But in reality, the unemployment rate in the US in America actually isn't bad at all. In fact, it's pretty good. Payroll numbers are high and all that. But most recently, payrolls in the US hit their lowest point in the past 6 months, with only 175,000 new jobs added last month. And as for hourly wages, as shown below, they're at their lowest in almost 3 years. Now, if we talk about whether the business sector can handle this, let me point to the banking sector first, because that's the clearest example. According to CNBC reports, out of all the banks in the United States, about 4,000 in total, 282 banks have already collapsed because they just couldn't handle the financial costs. Interest rates are high, right? High interest rates mean more debt. And the industry that's really on the verge of collapsing is commercial real estate. That means commercial properties, like those tall buildings with lots of office space. These guys borrow a lot and have high expenses. So with high interest rates, they're really starting to show signs that they can't afford to pay. So the banks can't collect on these debts, which is why those banks end up collapsing. CNBC even broke it down, showing that the total value of these bad debts that can't be collected is as high as $900 billion. Of the banks that have collapsed, 265 are small banks, 16 are medium-sized banks, and then there are large banks with assets worth more than $116 billion. There's one more bank in that category. So if all 282 of these troubled banks actually collapse, it would be a disaster that President Joe Biden's administration simply couldn't handle, especially in this election year. That's why the mission to strengthen the US dollar has become. This is the main mission that Janet Yellen must accomplish. So the fact that the government needs to spend a lot, keep spending continuously, and borrow heavily is something we can all see happening together. The United States will keep doing this and will ramp it up even more until the election in November. The evidence for this statement comes from Bloomberg, which reported that the US government has borrowed even more money. It increased to $243 billion, which is more than what was expected in the previous quarter. As for the next quarter, it's projected that borrowing will rise to $847 billion. But do you know what the problem is? The problem is that the United States needs to issue a lot of debt, right? But foreign countries, they don't want to take on American debt anymore. That is, they don't want to hold US government bonds anymore. If you look at this graph, since 2009, US government bonds, there used to be a time when foreign countries held a very high proportion, over 55%. But this year, it has steadily dropped to just 30%. So the only thing now that would make investors willing to buy US government bonds is just pay higher interest, right? But you also have to consider that if you're going to buy US government bonds and they have to pay that much interest, you have to wonder what debtor could keep paying such high interest forever, right? And speaking of how strong the US dollar is right now, how much of a trade advantage does that give over other countries? Let's take a look at this chart. This chart comes from news in South Korea. They basically came out and said, hey, I can't take it anymore, and started complaining too, because the US dollar is so strong, it means that other countries have to pay more when buying goods in dollars, right? And if a country imports more goods than others, that country is basically out of luck. South Korea is one of those countries. It imports goods for production, making up as much as 50% of the country's total imports. That's why South Korea was the first to cry out about this. The products they import are what they call intermediate products, which are goods used for manufacturing, not final products. So this drives up the production costs for their industries, which means their competitiveness drops because it's more expensive to produce goods, making it harder to do business. Now, let's take a look at the countries that import intermediate goods, or goods used to make other products. At the very bottom, the luckiest ones who import the least are the United States. And since the US dollar is strong, that means the US can import goods cheaper than other countries. And look at the ones at the top here. These are the G7 countries, except for the United States. So the US has a trade advantage over all these countries. Finally, let me sum it up for you. In the end, with everything we've talked about, when will the US actually collapse? Honestly, it's really hard for the US to fall because the US has a special ability to make its economic numbers look good, whether it's by borrowing a lot, and then they make their currency stronger so they can buy things from other places more cheaply, which lowers their production costs and gives them a competitive advantage over other countries. Now, you might ask, why is the United States able to borrow so much? Well, ever since the Bretton Woods system was established, it made every country use the US dollar as the reserve currency. Every country buys US government bonds to serve as foreign reserves. Thailand has a lot of them too, which is why the United States can borrow so much, because the US dollar is the reserve currency. So that's the answer to why among the G7 countries, except for the US, even though their economies are similar, only the US economy seems to be holding up. The answer is actually pretty simple. It's because the currencies of other countries, those that aren't the US dollar, they don't have the status of being a reserve currency, you see?